Joe Mitchell walked into the Mercedes dealership in Dallas, wearing mud-caked boots and a John Deere cap that betrayed his farming roots. The three salesmen in their $1,000 suits burst out laughing when he asked to see the S-Class. "What you gonna pay with, Corn?" sneered Brad, the sales manager, while the others recorded everything on their phones for social media. Joe lowered his head, humiliated, and walked out in silence. But what the salesman didn't know was that beneath that worn cap was the man who had just sold his agricultural land for the biggest real estate deal of the decade, $800 million. 3 days later, Joe returned. Not alone. With him were Mercedes executives from Germany and a check to purchase the entire dealership chain. "Mr. Brad," he said calmly, as the former sales manager turned pale, "now I'll pay with something better than milk money. I'll pay with your termination letter." But the real revenge wasn't the firing. It was what Joe would do with those dealerships. Transform them into the first free training centers for young farmers wanting to modernize their operations. And Brad? He'd become the janitor cleaning muddy boots at the entrance. The AutoPremier dealership in Dallas gleamed like a temple of capitalism that October morning. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased Mercedes, BMWs, and Porsches that cost more than most homes, while inside, Italian marble reflected LED lights designed to make every chrome detail sparkle. It was a world where money wasn't counted, but flaunted, where appearance mattered more than substance. Joe Mitchell parked his 1998 Ford F-150, the one he used for hauling hay, in the farthest corner of the parking lot. At 72, after a lifetime working the land on his family farm in East Texas, he'd decided it was time for one luxury. Not out of vanity, but for his wife Betty, who after 50 years of marriage and sacrifice deserved to travel in comfort to her cancer treatments in Houston. He entered the dealership in his everyday clothes, faded plaid shirt worn thin from washing, worn jeans that were clean but showed their age, work boots that carried traces of the soil he loved, and his father's old John Deere cap he'd worn for 40 years. He hadn't changed on purpose. He wanted to see if there was still room for humanity in this temple of luxury. Brad Coleman, sales manager, saw him enter from his glass-walled office. 35 years of arrogance packaged in a $3,000 suit, he sized Joe up with one glance and immediately categorized him. Time waster, browser, probably one of those old-timers who come to dream about cars they'll never afford. He signaled to his two subordinates, Tyler and Jason, young sharks who saw every customer not as a person, but as a potential commission. Joe approached a Mercedes S-Class displayed on a rotating platform, his eyes bright as he imagined Betty sitting in those leather seats, finally comfortable after years on the worn bench of the F-150. He reached out a calloused hand to touch the body, when Brad's voice cut through him like a blade. "Don't touch with dirty hands. That one costs 200 grand. Joe turned slowly. Brad stood there with Tyler and Jason, all three wearing smirks of superiority. Tyler already had his phone out, recording what they clearly considered comedy gold. Joe, with the dignity of someone who'd worked honestly his whole life, calmly responded that he was interested in buying. The laughter that erupted was cruel and immediate. Brad didn't hold back, launching increasingly offensive jokes. Asked if he planned to pay in crops, maybe corn and soybeans. Jason added they might accept cattle as a down payment. Tyler zoomed in on the John Deere cap, the muddy boots, laughing as he uploaded the video to TikTok with Novichok farmer in the dealership. Other customers, polished folks in suits and ties, had stopped to watch. Some laughed, others looked away, embarrassed. A young couple was recording too. Joe had become the day's entertainment, the unwitting clown for Dallas's elite amusement. With his voice growing quieter, Joe tried to explain he had the money, that he just wanted to see the car. Brad pretended to call security, saying there was a disruptive element bothering real customers. The humiliation was complete. Joe lowered his head, that gesture of surrender he'd sworn never to make, and headed for the exit. Before crossing the threshold, he turned one last time. Brad and his crew were still laughing, reviewing the video on the phone. Joe stared at them for a long moment, memorizing every face, then said a single sentence no one heard over the laughter. "I'll teach y'all what a man's really worth." He returned to his F-150 and sat for long minutes, hands shaking not from anger, but from the sadness of a world that had lost respect for those who earn their bread by the sweat of their brow. Then he took out his phone and called his lawyer. The sale of the land to the logistics multinational had been completed that very morning. $800 million, the fruit of generations of Mitchells who had transformed swampland into prime agricultural property, now strategically positioned for Europe's largest logistics hub. But Joe didn't want revenge. He wanted justice. And above all, he wanted to teach a lesson Dallas would never forget. 3 days after the humiliation, Dallas woke to news that shook the luxury automotive world. A mysterious buyer had made an offer that couldn't be refused for the entire AutoPremier chain. 50 dealerships across America, a $2 billion empire. The most shocking part was that the buyer had one non-negotiable condition. He wanted to be personally present for the staff announcement at the Dallas location. Brad Coleman arrived at work that morning convinced the sale would mean a promotion. He was the best at sales, ruthless and efficient. The new owner would surely appreciate his numbers. He walked into the conference room whistling, where all employees had been summoned, from the regional CEO to the last mechanic. When the doors opened and Joe Mitchell entered, the silence was deafening. But this wasn't the same Joe from 3 days ago. He still wore jeans and a plaid shirt, still the same boots, still the John Deere cap. The only difference was his entourage, the CEO of Mercedes USA, the president of BMW North America, lawyers in pinstripes who looked like sharks in human form. Brad felt his blood freeze when Joe took the microphone. The farmer's voice was calm, measured, devoid of revenge, but loaded with determination. He told his story, how his grandfather had cleared that land with his bare hands, how his father had transformed marshland into fertile fields, how he'd innovated with sustainable techniques when everyone said he was crazy, how that land, mocked for generations as dirt farming, had become the strategic point for American commerce. $800 million, paid in cash. Then he showed the video, the one Tyler had uploaded to TikTok. 3 million views, 100,000 outraged comments. Brad's face, mocking an elderly gentleman, had gone viral as a symbol of luxury's arrogance toward working people. Joe announced immediate changes. The Dallas dealership would be transformed. Half the space would become a free training center for young farmers wanting to modernize their operations with sustainable technology. The other half would continue selling cars, but with a difference. Every salesperson would have to work 1 month a year on farms to understand where their food comes from. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for, the firings. Tyler and Jason were first, terminated with minimum severance. But for Brad, Joe had something special. Not termination. That would be too easy. He offered him a janitor contract. His job? Cleaning the boots of farmers who would come to the training center. Every day for the next 5 years, or he'd lose every reference in the automotive world with a devastating non-compete clause. Brad went ballistic. He yelled, threatened lawsuits, talked about discrimination. But the videos were there. His face humiliating an elderly man was everywhere. No other dealership would ever hire him. The choice was simple: janitor for Joe or starve on the street. 6 months after the acquisition, the former AutoPremier Dallas was unrecognizable. Half the showroom had been transformed into state-of-the-art classrooms, where young farmers learned to use drones for precision agriculture, software to optimize yields, vertical farming techniques. The other half still sold luxury cars, but with a fundamental difference. Every purchase funded a scholarship for a young farmer. Joe had hired a new sales team. Not young sharks in Armani, chosen for their ruthlessness, but people with stories who understood the value of work. There was Miguel, former Ford factory worker who knew every bolt of every car. Samantha, an engineer who'd driven Uber for years before getting her chance. Marcus, ex-military, who treated every customer with the same respect, whether they arrived in a Ferrari or a beat-up Honda. But the real attraction was Brad. Every morning, the former sales manager arrived in his janitor uniform. At first, he'd tried to maintain his arrogance, but reality had broken him. Cleaning mud from the boots of farmers who earned more than him with innovative organic production was a daily lesson in humility. The turning point came when his 15-year-old son visited. The boy, raised in the cult of easy money and appearances, saw his father on his knees cleaning boots. Brad expected contempt. Instead, his son said something that destroyed and rebuilt him. "Dad, for the first time, I see you doing something honest." It was Betty, Joe's wife, who really changed Brad. Despite the cancer consuming her, she came every week to the center, not to check up, but to bring lunch to the students. One day, she found Brad crying in the supply closet. She didn't judge. She sat beside him and told him about Joe coming home from the fields so tired he'd collapse fully dressed, how they'd saved every penny to send their kids to college.
Enjoying the story? Give it a little like and don't forget to subscribe. Now then, let's carry on.
How respect is earned with sweat, not contempt. Brad began to change, slowly, painfully, like a broken bone healing. He started talking to the young farmers, getting interested in their stories. He discovered many had degrees, were innovating, making millions with revolutionary ideas. His world of certainties crumbled and rebuilt. One day, a young agricultural entrepreneur came in interested in a Tesla Model X. The new salespeople welcomed him respectfully, but he asked for Brad. He'd seen him in the viral video, wanted to be served by him. Brad expected another humiliation. Instead, the young man said, "I know what it means to fall and get back up. Joe saved me with a scholarship when my dad died. Now I make $3 million a year with my hydroponic greenhouses. I want you to sell me the car, because I want you to understand that you never judge by clothes." That Tesla sale was Brad's rebirth, not as an arrogant salesman, but as a man who'd learned the hardest lesson. A person's value isn't in their bank account or clothes, but in their humanity. A year after the acquisition, Joe Mitchell had become a national phenomenon. His story had been told on every talk show, studied in business schools, cited by the president as an example of redemption and social justice. But Joe remained the same. Jeans, plaid shirt, John Deere cap. The only concession to luxury was the Mercedes S-Class he'd finally bought, where Betty could rest comfortably during trips for treatment. The training center had become a model exported across America. Young people from every state came to learn how to transform traditional agriculture into innovative enterprise. All 50 AutoPremier dealerships had been transformed into hybrid centers, half luxury sales, half agricultural training. Profits had tripled because the model attracted new clientele, successful agricultural entrepreneurs who bought luxury cars, but also investors who saw sustainable agriculture as the future. Brad had become director of the Dallas Training Center. His transformation was complete, from arrogance to humility, from contempt to respect. He gave talks on how his viral video had saved his life, forcing him to see the world from another perspective. He always showed the video, bearing the shame, then told how Joe had given him a second chance when he could have destroyed him. But the real twist came when Mercedes USA offered Joe the position of CEO for North America. The proposal was astronomical: $50 million a year, office in Atlanta, power over thousands of dealerships. Joe made them wait 3 days, then gave his answer at a press conference that shocked the corporate world. He refused. said he was 73 with a sick wife who wanted to stay close to their land. That money beyond a certain point becomes just numbers. That he preferred watching his kids from the center grow rather than sales graphs. But above all, he said a phrase that went more viral than the original video. "I already have everything I need, the respect of those who humiliated me, the love of those beside me, and the satisfaction of having transformed contempt into opportunity for thousands of young people." Mercedes accepted his counter-proposal. Joe would remain a strategic consultant, working from his Texas farm, developing the social responsibility program that would transform the brand into a sustainability leader. His compensation? $1 million a year, all donated to scholarships. 2 years later, Betty Mitchell died peacefully in her bed, surrounded by family. Her last months had been spent traveling comfortably in the Mercedes Joe had bought for her, seeing the ocean, mountains, everything a life of sacrifice hadn't allowed. Thousands attended the funeral. Young farmers who owed everything to Joe, transformed dealership employees, even the Mercedes CEO flew in from Germany. Brad was in the front row, crying without shame. After the ceremony, he approached Joe and told him something that had tormented him for 2 years. His mother, before dying 10 years earlier, had been humiliated in a luxury store for dressing modestly. He'd done nothing, had even been ashamed of her. By humiliating Joe, he'd repeated the cycle of contempt he'd suffered. Joe hugged him, told him forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but builds the future. That Betty, before dying, had asked about Brad, wanted to know if he was okay, if he'd learned. She was more worried about him than herself. A month after Betty's death, Joe made an announcement that shocked everyone. He would sell his share of the AutoPremier dealerships, about $1 billion in value, but not to an investment fund or tycoon. He sold it to the employees. Every person working in the 50 dealerships became a shareholder. Brad received 5%, the largest share after what Joe kept to ensure the social mission. The clause was simple. The company had to forever maintain the hybrid model, half luxury, half training. Profits beyond a certain threshold had to be reinvested in scholarships. And every year, on the anniversary of the viral video, all employees had to work 1 day in the fields to remember where food comes from, where real wealth comes from. 5 years after the humiliation that changed everything, Joe Mitchell turned 80. His health was declining, but his spirit remained strong. The empire he'd built from revenge transformed into justice was now a model studied worldwide. AutoPremier academies were in 20 countries, had trained 50,000 young farmers, created 10,000 innovative agricultural businesses. Brad had become Group CEO, chosen unanimously by employee shareholders. His story, from viral humiliation to redemption, had become a TED Talk viewed 100 million times. But every morning, before entering his office, he personally cleaned the boots of a young farmer, not as punishment, but to remember. Joe called one last press conference at the old Dallas dealership, now the beating heart of the training empire. He arrived as always. Jeans, plaid shirt, boots, but this time without the John Deere cap. He held it in his hands, the cap his father had given him, which had become the symbol of humiliation, then redemption. He called to the stage an 18-year-old boy, Carlos, son of Mexican immigrants, first in his family to graduate, genius of vertical agriculture who'd already patented 3 innovations. He'd been the first scholarship recipient at the center, now ran a $20 million business employing 50 people. Joe placed the cap on Carlos's head. The gesture was simple, but the meaning profound. It wasn't just a cap, it was the symbol that a man's value isn't in what he wears, but what he does. Carlos cried. The audience stood. The applause lasted 10 minutes. Then Joe spoke publicly for the last time. He told how the humiliation he'd suffered had actually been a gift. Without that moment of pain, he'd never have transformed his fortune into opportunity for thousands. Without Brad's cruelty, he'd never have discovered the human capacity to change and grow. Without the viral video, the world would never have seen that behind every person is a story deserving respect. He announced that all his remaining assets, about $300 million, would go to the Betty Mitchell Foundation for Sustainable Agricultural Education. But with a particular clause: every year, on his birthday, anyone who'd received help from the foundation had to perform an act of kindness toward someone society considers invisible: a janitor, a waiter, a farmer. Remember that human value has no price or uniform. Brad stepped onto the stage and did something no one expected. He knelt before Joe, not in humiliation, but respect. He cleaned his boots, this time actually dirty from the field where Joe had worked that morning for the last time. As he did it, he said into the microphone, "This man taught me that the greatest humiliation isn't cleaning others' boots, but not seeing the humanity in those we consider inferior." Joe died 6 months later, in his sleep, on his East Texas farm. 20,000 attended the funeral. Heads of state, multinational CEOs, but above all, farmers, workers, young people who owed everything to a man who'd transformed contempt into dignity. On his gravestone, a simple inscription: Joe Mitchell, farmer. He sowed respect, he harvested justice. Brad visits that grave every week, always brings fresh flowers, and cleans the headstone with the same care he cleaned boots. Then he sits on the bench beside it and tells Joe how the center's doing, how many kids received scholarships, how many lives have changed. One day, a child visiting the cemetery with his grandmother asked why such a well-dressed man was cleaning a grave. Brad smiled and answered, "Because this man taught me that real luxury isn't what you wear, but what you are. And I was poor inside until he enriched me with his lesson." The child didn't understand, but the grandmother did. She was one of the first scholarship recipients, now owner of a successful organic farm. She took off the straw hat she wore, the same style Joe had made famous, and placed it on the grave. "For you, Mr. Mitchell, to remind you that the seeds you planted keep growing." And as the sun set over the East Texas fields, turning the wheat golden as it swayed in the wind, Joe Mitchell's legacy lived on. Not in buildings or bank accounts, but in every person who'd learned that respect can't be bought or sold. It's earned with sweat, maintained with humility, and multiplies when we transform humiliation into growth opportunity for all. The original Humiliation video is still online, now viewed 200 million times, but it's no longer a symbol of arrogance. It's become the world's most powerful reminder: never judge a person by their clothes or job. Because that farmer with the John Deere cap and mud-caked boots didn't just buy a fleet of luxury cars, he bought a lesson in humanity the world will never forget. Like, if you believe respect is worth more than money, comment with the moment that touched you most. Share to honor all invisible workers who deserve dignity. Subscribe for more stories of redemption and true justice. Sometimes the greatest humiliation becomes the most powerful lesson. Sometimes a farmer can teach the whole world what real nobility means. And sometimes, just sometimes, a John Deere cap is worth more than a crown.